Well, it's great to be with you to talk about one of our faculty members' most recent books that's just come out this year, You Are Not Your Own, Belonging to God and Inhuman World. It's by Dr. Alan Noble, who's with us today. And I'm excited to talk with you about this book.
Yes.
And how long did you work on this? This was a pretty significant piece of work.
So probably about 3 years of ideas and then reading and research and drafting and editing. So, and if it doesn't read like 3 years worth of work, then that's okay. That happens.
Well, this is one of the questions that I do have as we think about this book, because there are a few of us that have written books like this in a time of pandemic.
Oh yeah.
And you talk about this a little bit in the book about how you gave some of the lectures at different places during the pandemic. You even talk
Yes.
about a COVID-19 delirium. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about, that experience of writing in the pandemic and working through this book. And then I want to get into kind of the logic and the flow of the book a little bit.
So thankfully, when the pandemic was at its worst, I had already drafted a full thing and gotten feedback back. So I was just editing at that time, just editing the manuscripts. But I did have to give a series of lectures that I was supposed to do in person, and then I got COVID, so I did them over Zoom. And I don't know how I did that for 3 days, for 4 hours a day, but I did it, and that was very helpful for finishing the edits.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. This is your second major book. The first one, Disruptive Witness, went on to receive various accolades and awards, great analysis of not only our present world, but also how we can live differently, disruptively, Christian witness in our modern world. This book does a little bit, something a little bit different. It seems to me, it goes a bit more depth into a diagnosis of some of the malaise of the modern world, some of the challenges that we face, and then provides response. Is that about right?
Yeah, so I think of this book as taking a step back and sort of asking the question behind the question of the first book. So the first book is asking, why is it that we're distracted all the time? What does that do to our souls? How does that make evangelism and speaking to the truth about the gospel more difficult? And how does that overlay with living in a secular society, which exacerbates all of the distractions? So in going around and speaking about that book, I had a lot of people coming up to me and asking, well, what are the techniques that I need to not be distracted? They all wanted a 5-point plan. And as I thought about it, and I realized, I don't have this all figured out myself. And it occurred to me that some of the people talking, they weren't distracting themselves because they didn't want to face the sin within them, right? And in the first book, I primarily talked about the fact that we distract ourselves because we don't want to acknowledge who we are before God. It's a terrifying feeling. But it occurred to me that talking with various people that although that is certainly a thing, for some people, there's something else motivating it. They come home from work and they want to watch 5 episodes of a TV show because they're depressed and they're anxious. And sometimes it's not because of sin, it's because of disorder in the world. And so I'm taking a step back and sort of one of the motives behind writing this and exploring this topic was, what else could be going on? What else could be going on that could be driving people to this? And so in part, that's what motivates this text.
And I love this, the cover of the book. I think it kind of tells the story. And if you haven't picked up a copy of this, you need to. But it has this picture of a person or a figure pushing a boulder up a mountain. Now, this is not original to you or the, the...
We didn't steal the cover.
Right.
If that's what you're accusing me of.
No. Yes. You heard it
this
here
is
first.
This is how you tell me.
That's right. I've been meaning to tell you this in a very public way. Might as well do it now.
Good. Fine.
So, no, but this is actually a take or a riff on an ancient Greek tale, isn't it? The Myth of Sisyphus.
That's right.
So tell us about that.
Yeah. So we went through several cover designs. When they came across this, I was like, this is perfect. And it's a fantastic cover. I think the first book actually only won an award for the cover. Which is fine, frankly. It was a great cover, but this is a better cover, and it did not. It did not win the same award. So now this is me saying that was inappropriate. This should have won the award. So it's the Myth of Sisyphus, and I'm I'm pointing back to the Greek myth, but also as it's interpreted throughout Western
Right.
tradition, specifically looking at the French existentialist, although you wouldn't agree with it, that title, philosopher Camus,
Right.
who writes the book, The Myth of
Right.
Sisyphus, and about the absurd nature of living in the world, a world without meaning, where the best that we can do is continue to push on, pushing this boulder up a hill. So the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus gets punished by the gods, and his punishment in Hades is he has to push a giant boulder up a massive hill, and when he gets to the top, it rolls back down, and he has to walk back down and then push it up again for eternity. Now Camus says that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. That's his famous
Right.
saying from that book. In other words, even though we live in a meaningless world, what are we doing in our lives? We're just pushing these massive boulders up a hill and they
Right.
come back down. There is no meaning. We have to embrace that fact and choose to have the courage to live anyway, right?
Right.
And so that's his vision. And in the book, I point out, although that Camus' idea sounds nice, Sisyphus is still in hell.
Right.
Which to me means that it's
not a good-
It's not a good
deal.
place.
Yeah.
It's not a good place to be. This is still a disordered
Right.
universe. But I'm using it as also as this a way of expressing a kind of modern fatigue. There's been a lot
Right.
of talk about a burnout generation, specifically millennials, but I think it's much broader than that. I see it in some younger generation and older. A feeling of exhaustion.
Right.
I talk to a lot of people who will say, in their own minds or sometimes verbally, I just need to get through the day.
Right.
Right? And I find myself thinking, well, if you regularly say, I just need to get through the day, then you're thinking of time as a burden to be suffered through, not as a
Right.
gift of grace from God. Something is deeply disordered, right? Well, what do you mean when you're saying, I just need to get through the day? You're just pushing that boulder up the hill.
That's right.
And it's going to roll back down the next morning, and you're going to struggle to get out of bed.
And the
because
next
you know,
day you suffer through, do it again, and do it again, and do it again.
Which raises this question, what is this boulder?
Right.
Is it just sin? Is it just
Right.
a fall? Or could there be certain disorders in the structure of our society that make it not more difficult than the past, let's say, because I think comparison is very difficult historically, but uniquely difficult. There's a unique challenge in living in the modern world because it's not designed for humans as God created us, and that creates friction and anxiety and depression and frustration.
And disconnection and a sense of dissonance to
Yes.
the rhythms of God's created world. In fact, one of the things that I think is provocative about this book, you actually say, you don't make any bones about it, we live in an inhuman world.
Yeah.
So if there's something wrong with this world where it's fundamentally inhuman,
Yeah.
I think, as I read the book, the first 100 or so pages, you kind of diagnose the problem. So, Alan,
Yeah.
what's wrong with our world?
Yeah. So the argument I make is this. Any society, every society is designed by people with a certain idea of what it means to be a human. So if you and I don't know, we don't have a shared idea of what it means to be a human, then we can't design streets,
Right.
schools, government, churches, communities, families, anything. We really have to have an idea, what does it mean to be a human? What are our goals? What are our ends? So if that's true,
And that could be
hypothetically-
explicit or implicit.
Absolutely.
It could be, and a lot of times it's implicit, so we just go through the motions. And you talk about this. Yeah.
Exactly. Mostly we don't verbalize it, but it exists nevertheless
Yeah.
under the surface. So hypothetically, if we have a civilization, a society where we get humanity wrong, like we don't understand what it means to be a human,
Right.
then we would create an environment that is really toxic, that makes us agitated and anxious and alienated and a sense of that we don't have any belonging. That's what it would be like. And I describe it using this idea of zoochosis.
Right.
Right? And so in the zoo, if you've ever seen an animal pacing in circles, endlessly, right? So tigers, bears will often do this, and you'll see the tracks on the ground, the grass has been worn away just in one circle. This animal has been pacing for hours, maybe all day when you come and see it in the zoo, and you're hot, and you're thinking, this is all this animal does.
Right.
So they've got this big, beautiful cage, they've got a lake, they've got there's a waterfall. This is nicer than my backyard, and yet he's just pacing in circles.
Right.
Why is that? Well, it's a term called zoochosis, a psychosis of being caged. These animals were not actually made to be caged, no matter how well designed. This is the key. Imagine this. You can afford the best zoologists. I don't know who these people technically are, but
Persons who do this
zookeepers,
then.
right? Who design these cages perfectly for these animals, and yet they fail.
Right.
The animal is still sick. And what killed me when I was researching this was when I discovered that the way they treat zoochosis is antidepressants and an enrichment activity. So they'll throw them like a weighted ball. And I thought, whoa, that's me.
Yeah.
Like when I'm suffering in society says, here's some antidepressants and here's something to distract you.
Yeah. And you talk about this in your diagnosis of the modern world. You're saying, hey, there's something fundamentally wrong. We feel it. We feel like those animals in the cage.
Right.
And instead of actually dealing with the root problem, we cope or we try to ameliorate the problem. And you use this phrase a number of times. You know, if you're depressed, great, society provides. And it might be medication. And you're not downplaying.
No.
These are real challenges that we all face, and so sometimes we do need medication.
Right.
You know, so it's not, you're not downplaying those realities. But what you're saying is, hey, let's get to the root of the deeper issue. And so if there's something wrong with the modern world, you talk about these this idea that I belong to myself.
Yeah.
And you have these responsibilities of self-belonging. So talk to us a little bit about that.
So when I said this hypothetical society that misunderstands humans, what I mean for our society is I think that we believe that we belong to ourselves. To be a human being, what does it mean to be alive, to exist in this world, is to fundamentally belong to yourself. And you have the responsibility of belonging to yourself. That's your task in life.
It's a big one.
It's a boulder. It is a boulder that we're pushing up the hill. So we tell young people, this is your story. You need to tell a beautiful, exciting story.
Yeah.
Right? You are a work of art, and you are going to determine what that beautiful work of art is. But we don't usually talk. That's the propaganda version.
Right.
The flip side of that is you don't have another option. So you have to make your life interesting. You have to make it exciting. You have to make it meaningful and purposeful. And if you don't, you are a failure, and you don't matter. That's the flip side. And young people know that implication, and they feel it in their chest, and it weighs on them. I've seen this many times.
Yeah.
And so I break down the responsibilities of self-belonging. I ask myself, well, if we belong to ourselves, what are the implications? And so I decided there's some overlap, but I said justification. We have to find a way of justifying our lives. Why do I exist? Why do I get to take up breath? Why is it worth me putting up with daily suffering?
Right.
My existence needs to be justified. I need to have an identity because no one can give me an identity now. I belong to myself. There is no preformed identity. I've got to figure it out on my own. And we know in society right now that is probably the most significant of these responsibilities. And then we have meaning. We've got to decide what is meaningful to me. Meaning is not given.
Right.
We can get suggestions from other people, artists, let's say, poets, novelists, movies, but there's no one giving us absolutes. Values, and then finally a sense of belonging. We get to choose where we belong. I'm born in a city, I'm born to a family, but I don't have to belong to them.
Right.
I can cut them off and decide that I belong wherever I feel like I belong. I belong to myself.
Yeah, and so it seems like our technology that we have, social media, it's supposed to provide a platform to launch those realities, identity, belonging, whatever, but it becomes this thing that you talk about this, how these actually become tools that exacerbate the problem. They don't ameliorate the problem.
Yeah, it's a great con. So the society says, all right, you just have to take on these responsibilities, accept that you are your own, and then you try to do it on your own, and you're like, I can't tell enough people who I am. I feel like my identity is vague and insubstantial. I need a way to express it to more people so I feel alive. Well, okay, society comes along and says, hey, we got you covered. We'll help you out. You can buy these clothes. You can buy this car. You could be on social media. These are the tools we're giving you to do the thing that we told you have to do. All right, so you start doing social media, and you realize, oh, man, I've expressed myself, my preferences in movies and politics or whatever it might be.
Identity, whatever it might be.
But it's not enough. I need to keep doing it, and I need to go on more platforms. And these social media platforms will say, hey, we've come out with a new way to post content because you need more and more ways. And while you're doing this, you're looking out and you're saying, everyone else is doing the exact same thing.
Right.
And most of them are doing it better than me. And so you're filled with this sense of inadequacy. The result is twofold. One, addiction. And this is going to be the case. It's not just social media. It's all of these coping mechanisms. They end up in addiction because the promise is a lie. And once the promise is a lie, you can have this fulfilled life if you take this burden. If that's a lie, everything you try to do to fulfill that is just going to demand more and more and more of your psyche, your time, your resources, your money, et cetera. Okay? And the second is a sense of inadequacy. Because the further you go along this path, the more you realize it's still not working. It's still not working. And it's crushing.
And so the despair gets greater, the sense of inadequacy gets greater. And, you and I and our faculty here, especially at OBU, we have a bird's eye view on this because this is especially true in that generation that's grown up with social media, the 2007 generation. And they're the folks who are living this reality in a unique way. And we should have a lot of compassion and grace. You talk about grace in your book. We should have a lot of compassion and grace for this generation that's navigating realities that can be, and I learned this phrase when we lived in the UK. I love it. It's, we live with these soul-destroying realities. And I feel like, if we're honest with a lot of our folks, and maybe ourselves, we feel this weight of belonging or responsibilities of the self, and all of a sudden it's soul destroying. It's not life giving.
Very often, I've heard many people, not here, but at OBU, but across the country, complain about the young people who don't have the drive, who give up, who are too weak, and so on and so forth. Well, I'll tell you, I have had many situations where a student will come to me with a paper that's days late. They won't even have the paper done. And when I ask them what happened, they'll say something like, I tried to write it over the weekend, but the anxiety.
Right.
And these are good students. These are really, and so I ended up watching 10 Hours of Friends. Now that student, somebody from the outside will look at that student and say, see, these young kids, they're lazy. And I want to say, that student cares too much. It's not that they don't care enough. You totally misunderstand. They care so much. They believe, they have been taught that everything rides on their success. And so when they feel like they might fail, they seize up. And so my task as a professor is to respond in grace and to help walk them through, okay, well, why is this so difficult? What can we do to help you realize that, it's good to be excellent in your work, but this is not what justifies you. And you're loved by God.
Okay, and so just, if you could, I know this is not fair to do because you spend at least 100 pages doing this, but if you're diagnosing the problem with the modern world, in a sentence, what is wrong with our world? What is that boulder that we keep pushing uphill?
We are radically, hopelessly, only ever our own, and we have to make everything out of that being alone.
And you're saying that crushing weight is overwhelming, and it's almost like you're putting your finger on something that we all taste, smell, sense, feel. Yeah. But it's almost like we don't have the words, the language, the concepts to bring it out. So that's what you unpack.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we have a sense of what's wrong. I belong to myself, right? I am not my own, and I belong to myself. Therefore, I have to make something of my life and my world and make it justify my existence, provide a value system that makes sense, provide meaning and identity, and I've got to kind of suffer through. Yeah. And what we're finding is, and what you found is, it's just crushing us down. Yeah. Okay. So help us.
That's it. That's all I got. Thank you.
Yeah. See ya. Well, that's life, and hope you can cope. Second half of the book.
The second half of the book was difficult to write because, as I say, at the transition point, this is not a work of fiction. Yeah. And so what we want to hear is this. Here are the 5 steps that you need to take to change your mindset so that this is no longer a problem. Now, part of that idea that we can just take certain steps and then fix it is actually at the core of efficiency and technique, some of the problems that I've diagnosed in the first half. And so that's a separate issue. But the hope that I provide in the second half, that I don't provide, I point to, is that we are not our own but belong to God. And because of that, all these burdens that have been placed upon us by others, and we have accepted the burden of, right, we're complicit, we can lift those up. We can acknowledge this is a lie. There is nothing right here. This doesn't exist. It is a fundamental lie. Now, that is a tremendous relief. But there are 2 other responses that I address, 2 other aspects I address. One is, you can do that. You can acknowledge this is not true, but other people are going to still treat
Yeah,
you that way.
that's right.
And that's part of the difficulty, is that there's no way we can, that I know of, and I'd be very suspicious if somebody came along with a plan to fix this, where all of society can stops believing that they
Right.
are their own, and now we acknowledge we belong to God. That would be great. And I do think God can do that. He can redeem all things. And he saved Nineveh. I discuss
Right.
this in his book.
Yep.
He saved an entire city, repented. An
Right.
evil, wicked city repented, right? And so he can do that. I
Right.
can't.
Right.
And I have no plan for doing that except prayer and being faithful in my life.
Right.
So that's a reality. And the third thing I want to point to is that once you accept that you aren't your own but belong to God, you have to accept some responsibilities and burdens and obligations and duties that you're going to have to die to yourself.
Yeah.
You might not want to hear. I mentioned earlier belonging. Okay?
Yeah.
So if we belong, to God, we also have a belonging to our community
Right.
and to our family.
You even talk about to your place.
To our place. And so, and I say this to many of our students when they're thinking about careers and stuff, I encourage them to think first about where they are. Your hometown. What could your hometown use? Could they use a teacher? Could they use a pastor? Could they use a plumber? How could you help your community? Now, I don't tell them don't ever move anywhere, but I encourage them to think first where they are, because that city raised them.
Yeah.
That city invested in them, and they have a sense of belonging. And most contemporary people are not comfortable with that. We want to be told, you're a free agent, go
Yeah.
wherever you want. But that's not true.
Right. Now, getting back to that point, we are not our own, and
Yeah.
we belong to God. You
Yeah.
begin that discussion.
Yeah.
And I don't like this this phrase, well, what's the answer to the problem? Well, in a problem so complex as this, you're offering a cogent response, a beginning point that opens up all of life, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
But this chapter is the turning point in the book. You are not your own, but you belong to Christ. You open with this passage of Scripture, and you actually say this. Historically, the Christian church has answered these questions by first looking at the claim of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. Do you not know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Now, I like the fact that you've started there. What motivated that beginning point, that entry point? Was it was it the history of the church? It's such a powerful verse. This idea that, hey, if your identity is in Christ, you're not your own.
Yeah.
And you're not saying that's a burden. That's actually liberating.
And that's the paradox for modern people. It sounds like a burden. It sounds horrifying. To belong to yourself sounds safe, but to belong to someone else, you'll be abused, you'll be taken advantage of. So I think what was happening, I had various things in my own life, in the lives of my students, seeing things going on in the world where the world did seem inhuman. And then I was also thinking about broader social things, conversations about, let's say, religious liberty and gender and sex and all kinds of big public issues,
Sure.
right? And at some point, my pastor, we talked about the Heidelberg Catechism, first question and answer.
Yeah.
The Catechism asks, what is your only comfort in life and in death? And the answer they gave is that you are not your own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, which they get from Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So at that point, that was ringing in my ears, and it struck me, wow, how many of these conversations and how many of these personal dilemmas center on this question of belonging. To whom do you belong? Do you belong to yourself? Because if you do, there are certain things that naturally flow, that naturally follow. When marriage gets difficult, if I belong to myself, it naturally follows that I should leave and follow my heart.
Yeah.
Right? And the opposite is true. If I belong to God, then I also belong to my family.
Right.
And no matter how, what my personal desires may be, I have a commitment that I follow through. And it struck me that is a radically different way of understanding the world than we have been taught from all kinds of sources. And so I took that as it really is the starting point.
And so if we belong to God and we don't belong to ourselves, right, that means that, and this is kind of the paradoxical thing, what you're saying is, if I'm understanding you rightly, you're saying that opens up life.
Yeah.
It doesn't close down life.
Yeah.
It gives meaning to life. It doesn't close down or make life monotonous and boring.
Yeah.
It gives you a justification for life. It instills value. It instills meaning. It instills purpose. That's not crushing, but liberating. Now, for a lot of folks, when they hear about the Christian faith or the Christian church, and they think about obligations of the Christian church, in the world today and in the media today, you'll hear a lot of stories that are pretty atrocious. So, how in the world can you say, "I belong to God"? Begins a process of liberation and freedom and purpose, rather than oppression and bigotry and all the other things we see.
Yeah, and well, okay, we could talk about that in terms of church. We could also talk about it in terms of family.
Yeah.
Like many people, many people have families that are a mess.
Yeah.
There's abuse.
Sure.
There's trauma. There's people who are living violent, destructive lives, and there must be a way to love those people, not inviting abuse or permitting abuse to yourself, right? That's never done. But at the same time, you do have an obligation, right? So you might have someone, close to your family who struggles with addiction, and you have to set healthy boundaries. But if there's ever a point but you never stop praying, and if there's ever a point where they're willing to get help, you're there.
Right.
You're there. And the same thing is true of the church. All of these things, all of these obligations are hard. Being married, there'll be times where you think, gosh, that looks a whole lot better over there, and this is really hard. This is really hard. Work, belonging to a place. You'll belong to a place, and the place will betray you in some sense, or there'll be a problem, and you have to choose to suffer through it. Now, I'm very careful to argue that this is not at all an excuse to allow people to abuse you.
Yes, absolutely. You make that clear.
That's very clear in there. But it does mean it is a life of dying to self. I mean, this is one of the difficulties of the Christian faith. If you treat Christianity as a lifestyle option, Christianity loses every time, because as a lifestyle option, the selling point is you will die to yourself and your desires. And if we're on the marketplace, everyone else is saying, let's feed your desires.
Right.
But it's not a lifestyle option. It's the truth. And it's a truth that saves, paradoxically, through asking us to die to self. So, belonging to the church is a mess. It's a mess. But we are part of that body. And so our task is to be faithful. And that includes doing our work to pursue justice in the church.
Yes.
When there is abuse, to help uproot that for the sanctity, the purity of the church. That's part of our task, because we love the church. Just like in your family, you want to address toxic places and problems and abuse. So, it's hard.
But that's part of the obligation to God. I mean, I'm an Old Testament professor by training, and one of the things that I wrote this past year was on Micah chapter 6, right? The Lord has told you, O human, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, but to love mercy, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. So there are obligations when you belong to God.
That's right.
It's not like you can check out and just the world kind of goes to hell in a handbasket, and you're like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. I mean, no, there's a responsibility before God and your fellow humans to begin to engage the world well, to where the world reflects the glory of God in Christ as He's made manifest in the church. That's part of our obligation. And so I love that. But the other side of this, which I think is powerful, you come back around in the second half of the book to talk about, there with all of the coping mechanisms that our world provides, you really encourage folks to operate with grace with one another. Talk to us about grace in a world where people are shouted down left, right, and center for, you don't virtue signal enough, or you virtue signal too much, or whatever. So it's almost like we're all out to shout each other down.
That's right.
You're talking about a different way of being.
Yeah,
It's
so
grace.
when if you read through the first half of my book and you accept the diagnosis and you accept, wow, this is the highly competitive, toxic, overbearing world that we live in. If you love people, then your response needs to be, I need to show a lot of grace for people. When they are stumbling in public with their words, I need to show a lot of grace for them because they might feel, for example, that society has told them that they have to express themselves and their identity and their virtues out into the world. Otherwise, no one is going to know that they matter.
Right.
And so maybe they get it wrong sometimes, maybe tragically wrong. But if you know what's motivating that, you can have grace for them. And that doesn't mean you agree with them, and maybe you even challenge them a little bit, but you can do it in grace because you know, gosh, man, we're all burdened with that. We're all told that we have to think that way and do these sorts of things. So I get it. And with my students, as I talked about earlier, when that student comes in and says, I binge watched all for 10 hours, that student never comes in bragging. They always come in despair. And my task is to preach the gospel to them in that moment and show them grace because they don't need to be shamed. They need to understand, I get why you feel that anxiety and you want to turn to distractions. I've been there. I know this. Let's talk about what we can do. And there is hope. So no, we need if we're honest with each other, and the temptation, okay, why is it that we don't want to be gracious? Well, as I said earlier, we're in this hyper-competitive society where everyone is competing for attention and resources and eyeballs and affirmation and all these sorts of things. So there's a temptation to say, if I see a weakness in someone else, I got to take that shot. I got to take them down a notch because when they go down, I go up in some way.
And your identity is fulfilled, and
Precisely.
You're putting your stakes in the ground about your personal,
Yeah.
you're justifying your. Yeah, absolutely. But that only exacerbates the problem that you identify in the first half of the book. So
That's right.
It's really powerful. Okay, so in a sentence, I made you do it on the first half, diagnosing the problem. In terms of the response to the problem that you identify, in a sentence, what is the response that we need for our world today?
Yeah. Faulkner showed us that a sentence can be 2 pages.
Yeah, great.
So,
I love it.
yeah, I would say, the answer is that we are not our own but belong to God, and therefore we can rest in His providence and His grace and act in faithfulness, right? So practically what that means is that we, on a personal level, we have to develop habits of being able to identify these lies when they are presented to us. Sometimes they'll be presented from well-meaning authority sources. It might be a parent or a pastor or a teacher or a political, all kinds of people, because, and I stress this in the book, this isn't a book about those people over there outside the church. It's
exactly.
It's in all of us. I am affected by this, right? And so we need to be able to learn to acknowledge, because the worst thing is you can't identify a lie. Because when you can't identify it, the propaganda's won.
Yeah.
You're toast. You can't do anything. So see it for what it is, and then remind yourself of the truth that you belong to God. And so that effort, when you think to yourself, I've got to create my identity, I've got to project it out into the world and express myself, or I'm not real and I don't exist, you can remind yourself there is one witness who knows you and sees you perfectly, all your contradictions, all your confusion, all your doubt, all your sin, and He sees you and He sees His righteousness of His Son, and He loves you. So your identity is grounded. You might feel like it's in flux because society tells you that, but it's a lie.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't magically make everything go away, but it helps. It gives you agency, and that's key. The third thing, I think, is that we act in faithfulness. We can't wait until we feel good. We have to choose to act. And in this case, we act in obedience. We act on that belonging. We act knowing, treating other people as full human beings, encouraging other people to recognize that they belong to God. And that makes a difference. That makes, and I think what the church can do is create pockets of resistance, where there are spaces where groups of people live as if they belong to God, and from the outside, people notice that there is a difference. And if God wants to use that to change all of society, He can do what He wants.
Yeah.
But if not, that doesn't matter, because we are called to be faithful and do it anyway.
Yeah. The responsibility of us is to be faithful witnesses and allow God to do what God does. God's the miracle worker. If He wants to work a miracle, that's great. Let's see that happen.
So that's the fundamental difference between belonging to yourself. Because if you belong to yourself, you have to accomplish it.
Yeah.
Actually, the ends do justify it. You have to accomplish this. It has to be successful. But if we belong to God, we can say, for us, quoting Eliot, for us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business.
Yeah.
We just have to be faithful. And so when you're thinking about, for example, going back to abuses in the church, our task is not to make the church perfect on our own.
That's
right?
right.
Like that God didn't say, Alan, go fix all of the church.
Right.
No, my task is, where am I in my sphere of influence? What can I do to pursue the
right.
purity of the church? That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And that's the difference. Whereas if you belong to yourself, you can get saddled with, for example, justice in the world. And you can feel like, I have to fix all the problems of poverty or racial injustice or sexual injustice, whatever it might be. I'm the one. I've got to advocate all the time and fix all the things because that's my job.
Yeah, and I love this. If you begin where you are, we can begin to recognize not all the problems of the world have my name on it.
Yeah.
But some of them do.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility to step into that space that God opens up, especially in our local. So if we're talking about that, is it fair to say that, we can begin to diagnose some of the areas of brokenness in my own community? At OBU or on our camp, where are those broken spaces on our campus?
Yeah.
In our community,
or
in our world, or whatever it is, and then begin to work from the center outward,
That's
rather
right.
than again, our being awash with social media the way that it is. It's almost like every cause has to have my name on it, and it goes back to that problem of just that crushing weight of responsibility. Oh, I can't do this.
Yeah.
But if we belong to God, we allow the Spirit to guide us to. That's where I want you to work.
That's right.
This is how I want you to embody.
That's right. And it's not a quietism. There's no sense of where you're giving up, you're being hopeless, you're saying, well, this is not my job, I'm just going to wait for heaven.
Right.
And that's difficult. A lot of people struggle with that. They want to say, well, it's either everything or it's nothing.
Right.
And the reality is, God is everything, and He is going to act through us, and so we have to be faithful. Christians don't have the freedom, the liberty to say, I'm not responsible for anything. And they also don't have the liberty to say, I'm responsible for everything. Because both are lies.
Right.
And that's a tough place, a tough space to live in, but that's what we're called to, so we need to do it.
As we belong to God, I'm reminded of that teaching of Jesus about where He talks about the yokes, right?
Yes.
Take my yoke upon me, learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yeah.
It just echoes, I hear the echoes of that in this book.
Absolutely.
The yoke of Christ actually is easy and light. It's not crushing. And yet you're still working.
And it's a burden.
Yeah.
It's still a burden.
Yeah.
It's still a yoke. It's still a yoke. And I think that's because sometimes people will lie to you. But no, the Christian life, it's a yoke. It's work. It is suffering. It's going to be suffering. But guess what? It's suffering that you have been designed to endure by the grace of God, right? So that's the difference, right? Whereas that boulder we're pushing up the hill, you were not made to do that. And so it's going to crush you. It's a totally different idea, right?
Yeah.
So yes, the yoke of Christ is easy and light. It will feel heavy at times. But the truth is it's light because He's carrying it for you.
Yeah. Well, Alan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us
you.
about this new book. Again, You Are Not Your Own, Belonging to God in an Inhuman World. Would really encourage you to pick it up. It was encouraging and enlightening for me, and I think it would be for you. So, again, another great resource from one of our OBU professors, and I'm glad you're here.
Yeah,
I'm glad you're doing the work you're doing. Thanks so much.